Hey guys, welcome back to another long, mildly unsettling bedtime journey into the distant, smelly past. So, tonight I want you to get comfortable. Dim the lights, maybe light a candle, if you're feeling historically accurate, and imagine yourself drifting back to a world where the concept of personal hygiene was more of a philosophical debate than a routine. Because tonight, we're talking about why medieval people basically refused to bathe. Or, to be a little more polite, why they bathed selectively and infrequently, which is the historian's way of saying rarely and reluctantly. You've probably heard the old claim that people in the Middle Ages only bathed once a year. And like most sweeping historical generalizations, that's not entirely true, but it's also not completely false. So let's just say cleanliness was complicated. Very complicated. Scene 1. The medieval soap opera. Let's start with this image. You wake up in a 14th century English village. The air smells faintly of wet hay, smoke, and, well, humanity. You're wearing the same wool tunic you've had on for the last 3 weeks. It's stiff in some places, suspiciously soft in others, and you're not sure which is worse. You stretch, you yawn, and maybe you splash some cold water on your face. Congratulations, you've just performed your morning bath. Daily bathing, as we know it today, showers, soaps, conditioners, hot water, was not only impractical in the medieval world, it was basically impossible. Hot water required fuel, fuel cost money, and money, shockingly, was not evenly distributed in 1200 AD. So, the average person bathed when they could afford to, when they felt they really needed to, or, more often, when someone else forced them to, like their spouse or a priest. But here's the plot twist. It wasn't always this bad. Scene 2. When bathing was cool, then suddenly sinful. If we roll back even further to ancient Rome, people loved their baths. Public bathhouses were like the Starbucks of the Roman Empire. You'd go there to wash, socialize, gossip, or loudly complain about your senator. The Romans had entire systems of aqueducts feeding huge heated bath complexes. They had oils, scrapers, even proto-saunas. And they did this daily, which is wild considering they didn't even have shampoo, but they made it work. Then Rome fell. And with it, so did the plumbing, the infrastructure, and, apparently, the collective will to stay clean. By the time the early medieval period rolled in, bathing had gone from a pleasant civic ritual to something a little more morally confusing. Because, and this is crucial, the church got involved. Church versus soap. Now, before we start blaming the church for everyone smelling like goat stew, it's important to remember that medieval Christianity was deeply suspicious of anything that seemed too pleasurable. And well, warm baths are pleasurable. You're naked, you're relaxed, you might be tempted to think impure thoughts. And in a world where sin was basically the Wi-Fi connection between your soul and eternal damnation, that was a serious concern. So bathing, particularly in shared or mixed gender settings, began to feel spiritually risky. The idea of cleanliness is next to godliness didn't really show up until centuries later. In the Middle Ages, it was more like, filth is fine as long as your heart is pure. But again, that doesn't mean no one bathed at all. There were bathhouses in cities like Paris, London, and Prague, some of them quite popular. Unfortunately, over time, they became too popular for the wrong reasons, because, as it turns out, bathhouses had this funny little problem. They kept turning into brothels. Scene 4. The Steam Room Scandals. Let's imagine Paris, around 1250. You wander down a cobbled street, following the faint smell of steam and herbs. You arrive at a stew house, which sounds delicious, but in medieval slang, that meant a bathhouse. You step inside. It's warm, candlelit, cozy. There are tubs, attendants, maybe a bit of music, and also, let's say, activities that went slightly beyond the scope of personal hygiene. So, naturally, the church cracked down. By the late 1400s, most bathhouses had been shut down or severely restricted. And by the time the Black Death arrived, people were already starting to associate bathing with something even worse than sin: disease. Scene 5. The Black Death. Bathing gets a bad reputation. In the 14th century, Europe got a horrific, uninvited guest: the bubonic plague. And it didn't take long for people to start looking for someone or something to blame. Doctors and priests, who, to be fair, were doing their best with about 12% of modern medical knowledge, came up with a theory. Bathing might open the pores, and open pores let in bad air, or miasma. And miasma was believed to be how the plague spread. So, bathing equals open pores equals death. Not exactly a motivating equation. People began avoiding water contact entirely. Some wore amulets, some stuffed herbs up their sleeves, and others, famously, didn't change their clothes for months because they believed the layers of dirt acted like protective armor. You can imagine how well that aged. Scene 6. Layers upon layers. By the late Middle Ages, your average nobleman might have worn 3 or 4 layers of wool and linen all year round, and he might change his undergarments once a week if he was particularly modern. But here's where things get extra ironic. Many of these same nobles also owned beautifully tiled private baths in their castles. They just didn't use them much. Take King Louis XIV of France, for example, the Sun King himself. He famously hated bathing. His doctors believed water could weaken the body and disturb the humors. So instead, he simply changed his linen several times a day. And that, apparently, counted as cleaning. Perfume did the rest of the heavy lifting, because if you can't wash the smell away, you might as well just add another smell on top. Okay, in later centuries, particularly during the Renaissance and Baroque periods, the European elite mastered the art of olfactory deception. They invented complex perfumes, scented gloves, and even perfumed wigs. Queen Elizabeth I reportedly demanded that everyone near her keep themselves sweet and clean, meaning drenched in rosewater and lavender oil. No actual soap required. For nobles, cleanliness became more of a visual concept. White skin, soft hands, silken fabrics. That meant purity and refinement. The smell was someone else's problem. And yet, even amid all that perfume and pomp, a few people did quietly insist on actual hygiene. Monks, for instance, often had designated bath days, sometimes weekly. Hospitals in monastic settings required patients to be washed. So while the nobles were marinating in musk, the monks were actually cleaner than their kings. Okay, scene 8, the peasants' bath. As for peasants, yes, they did bathe, but usually outdoors, in rivers or wooden tubs, and mostly when the weather allowed it. It wasn't ritual, it was necessity. If you spent all day knee-deep in mud or manure, at some point, even theology takes a back seat to practicality. And peasants didn't have to worry much about bathhouse scandals. They didn't have bathhouses. They washed when they could, and when they couldn't, they just embraced nature's perfume. Okay,
On to scene 9, the slow return of clean. By the 17th and 18th centuries, science, actual science, began making a comeback. The connection between filth and illness started to become harder to ignore. Doctors like Antoine Lavoisier began experimenting with chemical soaps, and later, physicians promoted bathing for health reasons. But even then, the habit took time to return. As late as the 1800s, the average European or American family might have one bath night per week, usually Saturday. And that's where the tradition of the Sunday best outfit partly came from. You bathe Saturday, dress up Sunday, and hope it carries you through the rest of the week. So, to sum up where we are before drifting onward, medieval people didn't avoid bathing because they loved filth. They avoided it because water was dangerous, fuel was scarce, religion was strict, and medicine was confidently wrong. Cleanliness for them was a moral and social statement, not a hygienic one. And even though they didn't bathe daily, they still found endless ways to pretend they did. Now, let's float over to another part of this soapy tragedy, how the very idea of smell shaped entire centuries of class and culture.
The age of perfume and powder, when soap lost the class war. All right, so by now, medieval Europe has mostly survived the plagues, the church crackdowns, and several centuries of questionable hygiene habits. The bathhouses are gone, the monks are clean, and the nobles are layered. Not in personality, but in fabric. And as we drift into the 15th and 16th centuries, the dawn of the Renaissance, you might expect that people finally started thinking, hey, maybe washing my body is better than just spraying it with roses. But no, not yet. Instead, the upper classes doubled down on smelling good without actually being clean. Because, to be clear, bathing was now considered peasant work. And nobles didn't like being associated with peasants, not even hygienically. Scene 1. Smell as a social weapon. So, imagine you're an aristocrat in 1500s France. You've got more lace than sense, a wig taller than your moral compass, and an ego inflated by your family crest. Now, you might not have taken a bath in, say, 3 months, but you smell interesting. Your clothing is soaked with floral oils, your gloves have been rubbed with ambergris. That's whale vomit, by the way, but it smells surprisingly pleasant when aged. And your wig? It's dusted with lavender powder and occasionally crawling with something small and alive. If you're lucky, the scent of roses, musk, and expensive foreign resins masks the less noble odors underneath. If you're unlucky, you smell like a scented candle that lost a fight with a livestock pen. Either way, smell became a social weapon. Perfume said, I can afford not to work. I can afford to stink beautifully. It was wealth disguised as fragrance. Scene 2. Royals who reeked of roses and everything else. Let's talk about some of our favorite historical stinkers. King Henry VIII, for instance, reportedly took baths more often than most of his contemporaries, meaning maybe once every few weeks. But he also suffered from festering leg ulcers, so the results were mixed. He preferred to douse himself and his court in perfumes imported from Italy and the Ottoman Empire. Imagine a giant, sweaty, perfumed man surrounded by incense, basically a one-man walking cathedral. Queen Elizabeth I, on the other hand, was known for her obsession with cleanliness, of the symbolic kind. She owned several sets of fine linens and insisted on changing them regularly, believing the act of changing clothes cleansed the skin. She also used a white lead-based makeup called Venetian ceruse, which looked angelic and was slowly poisoning her. So she was immaculate, but toxic, a perfect metaphor for Tudor politics. And then we have Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, who brought luxurious filth to its absolute peak.
He had fountains, perfumes, and gold-plated chamber pots. But according to his own physician, he only took 2 full baths in his entire life. He preferred to be wiped down with linen cloths soaked in alcohol or floral water, essentially the royal equivalent of a baby wipe routine. When asked about the overwhelming odors of his court at Versailles, Louis reportedly said, "It is the perfume of my people," which is one way to spin it. Scene 4. Powdered people and perfumed politics. By the 17th and 18th centuries, perfume wasn't just a personal choice, it was political theater. Courtiers competed not just in status or gossip, but in scent. If your rival smelled of bergamot and myrrh, you needed jasmine and civet. If they wore powder made from violet roots, you'd commission a perfumer from Gross to craft something even rarer, like crushed pearls mixed with ambergris. Meanwhile, under all this finery, the body itself was quietly decomposing in linen and sweat. Clothes were rarely washed, wigs absorbed oil and lice, and chamber pots overflowed in corridors lined with silk. Visitors to Versailles often commented that the palace smelled of rot and flowers, a romantic way of saying decay, but make it fashionable. Even Marie Antoinette, that doomed icon of powdered grace, was obsessed with scent. She had her own perfumer who made custom rose, jasmine, and orange blossom oils. Her private boudoir at Petit Trianon was filled with bouquets, which conveniently helped disguise the stench from nearby drains. It's funny how history remembers her for saying, "let them eat cake," when what she really meant was probably closer to, "let them buy perfume." Scene 5. Cleanliness becomes a luxury again. Meanwhile, back among the peasants, yes, the ones doing all the actual labor, things were a little less fragrant, but sometimes more functional. A farmer might bathe once every few weeks or rinse off in a stream during the summer. They couldn't afford perfume, but they could afford to splash some water on their faces when they got too grimy to function. Ironically, that meant peasants were often cleaner than their perfumed masters. They didn't own wigs crawling with vermin or brocade waistcoats that hadn't seen daylight since Easter. They just didn't smell like a royal garden. And in 1700, that was enough to mark you as unrefined. It's a pattern that repeats throughout history. The rich invent elaborate ways to avoid doing what the poor do naturally. And hygiene, of all things, became another social divide.
Scene 5. The Science of Smell and the Great Soap Revival. Now, drifting toward the late 18th century, something quietly revolutionary happened. Science, yes, real, evidence-based science, started interfering with fashion. Doctors and chemists began studying disease and realizing that just maybe filth wasn't a divine test of character, it was just gross and dangerous. Soap, which had existed in crude forms for centuries, started to make a comeback. In the medieval world, soap was used mainly for laundry, but now new formulas made it gentler and more suitable for skin. Olive oil soaps from Castile, lye-based soaps from England, and scented bars from France began circulating through trade routes. And by the 1800s, with industrialization ramping up, soap became cheaper. Factories could produce it in bulk. People could afford it. And for the first time in centuries, cleanliness became fashionable again. Queen Victoria reportedly insisted that her children bathe regularly, a radical act compared to the generations before her. And Victorian etiquette manuals began preaching that cleanliness was a sign of moral and social virtue. In other words, the church finally caught up with the plumbing. Scene 6. The Great Bathing Boom. Public bathhouses made a triumphant return in the 19th century, this time without the steamy moral ambiguity.
Cities like London, Paris, and Berlin built grand bathing halls for their working-class citizens. You could pay a small fee, get a towel, some soap, and enjoy a proper hot soak. Doctors promoted bathing for health. Mothers promoted it for decency. And advertisers, well, they just promoted it for profit. Soap companies exploded in popularity. By the late 1800s, brands like Pears and Lever Brothers, which became Unilever, were plastering posters across Europe declaring that clean skin equaled good character. It wasn't just about hygiene anymore. It was identity, a moral facelift for the industrial age. And yet, even as daily bathing became normal, the irony of history lingered. The same aristocrats who once refused to wash were now the faces of luxury soap ads. The same church that had banned communal baths now blessed hospitals with hot water systems. Apparently, all it took to rediscover hygiene was capitalism. So, let's step back, quietly, slowly, and think about this odd journey. For thousands of years, humans have swung between loving, fearing, and misunderstanding water. We've turned bathing from a civic duty into a sin, from a luxury into a science, and from an afterthought into a daily ritual. And maybe that's what makes it so fascinating, because the history of bathing isn't just about soap or tubs, it's about how we define purity, morality, and class. It's about who gets to be clean and who gets blamed for the dirt. Today, we take a shower every morning without thinking. We have water heaters, shampoo aisles, and an app that reminds us to drink water. But not that long ago, people were terrified of getting wet. And if they smelled bad, they simply declared it fashionable. History, in a way, always finds a way to perfume itself. Now that we've rinsed off centuries of perfumed arrogance, let's drift into the next part of this sleepy saga, where we'll explore how medieval doctors, monks, and midwives tried to keep people healthy, often without touching water at all. Spoiler, it involves bloodletting, vinegar, and more holy water than you'd think. How medieval medicine tried to replace soap and failed spectacularly. All right, so we've already floated through the perfumed halls of European aristocracy and the long, grim centuries when people thought water might actually kill them. But what happens when people stop bathing and still have to deal with disease, dirt, and all the other side effects of being human? Enter medieval medicine, the original wellness influencer, complete with zero data and maximum confidence. Because when it came to health, medieval folks didn't say, maybe we should try washing our hands. They said, let's bleed him until he feels better. Scene 1. The humors, because why not mix blood and philosophy? Let's start with the theory of the 4 humors, the beating, dripping heart of medieval medicine. The ancient Greeks, particularly Hippocrates and Galen, came up with this delightful concept long before anyone had seen a germ under a microscope. According to them, your entire body and personality were governed by 4 magical fluids: blood, hot and moist; phlegm, cold and moist; yellow bile, hot and dry; and black bile, cold and dry. That's right. Health, emotion, and destiny all depended on your internal soup recipe. If you were cheerful and energetic, you were sanguine, full of blood. If you were sad and sluggish, you were melancholic, too much black bile. And if you were angry, well, you were just perfectly medieval. So if you came down with a fever, a rash, or even just bad vibes, your doctor didn't say, wash up. He said, let's rebalance your humors. How? By draining, sweating, vomiting, or purging until something, ideally you, gave up. Scene 2. Bloodletting, the medieval detox. Ah, bloodletting. The ancient art of solving every medical problem by removing the very thing keeping you alive. A physician would take a small, sharp knife or a leech, sometimes both if he was feeling creative, and open a vein to let out a controlled amount of blood. The idea was that illness came from too much heat or imbalance in your humors, so releasing blood would restore equilibrium. Did it work? No. Did that stop anyone? Also no. People were bled for everything: fever, headache, toothache, love sickness, boredom. Even kings weren't safe. King Charles II of England was bled, cupped, and purged so vigorously during his final illness that it's a miracle there was anything left of him to bury. Leeches, by the way, were considered a more gentle method. Doctors placed them on temples, necks, or legs depending on the ailment. You could buy premium leeches from special sellers who promised that their stock was vigorous and clean. Because if you're going to let a parasite drink your blood, you at least want a reputable one. Scene 3. When wine and urine were diagnostic tools. Bathing was out. But you know what was very in? Urine. Medieval doctors were obsessed with pee. They examined it for color, clarity, smell, and even taste. Yes, taste. Because apparently no one had invented boundaries yet. They'd pour it into a glass vessel called a urinal flask and hold it to the light like a fine vintage. Golden yellow meant health. Dark or cloudy meant trouble. Milky white meant something terrible involving your kidneys. There were whole books, uroscopes, with illustrations of pee colors for reference. A medieval doctor could diagnose your soul by sniffing your bladder output. And for many, the treatment was just as unpleasant. If your urine smelled sour, you might be prescribed to drink, yes, more urine. Sometimes your own, sometimes a virgin's, sometimes from a healthy donkey, because apparently that was an upgrade. So while modern people were developing spas and soap factories, medieval Europe was creating the first ever detox plans, just with less hashtags and a lot more confusion. Scene 4. When vinegar replaced water. Remember when we said people thought water was dangerous? That didn't mean they avoided all liquids. The wealthy replaced water with vinegar, wine, or herbal infusions for cleaning and disinfecting wounds, and occasionally their own bodies. They believed these liquids closed the pores, protecting the soul from corruption. So instead of taking a normal bath, you might stand in your room while your servant wiped you down with cloths soaked in rose water or vinegar. A noble's version of a sponge bath, if your sponge came with trauma. Doctors even recommended washing your hands in vinegar to prevent illness, which honestly not the worst advice they ever gave. Except they also recommended inhaling mercury fumes to cure syphilis, so the bar is low.
Scene 5. Herbal remedies, amulets, and pure guesswork. When in doubt, medieval medicine fell back on plants and prayer. Herbalism was the one area where people occasionally stumbled into something that actually worked. Garlic for infections, honey for wounds, willow bark for pain, which, fun fact, contains salicin, a natural precursor to aspirin. But for every useful remedy, there were 9 that sounded like someone's drunk cousin wrote them. To cure the plague, rub onions on your armpits. For fevers, sleep with a frog in a cloth bag on your stomach. For toothaches, burn a dead mouse and sniff the ashes. And when that didn't work, there were amulets, little charms worn around the neck to ward off sickness or evil air. Because if you couldn't wash the germs off, you might as well accessorize them. Monks and midwives also kept handwritten herbals. illustrated manuals showing which plants to use for what. Some of them were shockingly accurate. Others casually suggested using dragon's blood, which, spoiler, was just red tree resin. Still, for the average villager, these home remedies were all they had. And honestly, given that the nearest physician might have just finished bleeding a patient to death for sneezing, herbs weren't a bad bet. Scene 7. The plague makes a comeback. Then, as if to remind everyone that hygiene matters, the Black Death came roaring back in waves across the centuries. Every generation seemed to get their own version of bubonic panic. Doctors blamed everything from bad air to planetary misalignment to divine wrath. They wore those now iconic bird masks stuffed with herbs, believing the fragrant air inside would protect them from disease. They weren't entirely wrong. The herbs helped mask the smell of death, but that was about it. You'd think after losing a third of Europe's population, people might start rethinking their relationship with soap. But no, instead they doubled down on perfumes, incense, and holy water fumigations. Some even argued that bathing opened pores, making people more vulnerable to plague. So, the filthier you were, the safer you felt. If irony had a smell, it would have been 14th century Europe. Scene 8. Early sparks of science. Despite all this, little sparks of rationality began to flicker through the muck. In the late medieval period, Arab and Persian scholars like Avicenna and Al-Razi wrote medical texts emphasizing cleanliness and quarantine, concepts centuries ahead of their time. Their works were translated into Latin and trickled into universities. But progress was slow. Imagine trying to teach basic hygiene to people who thought bathing was demonic exfoliation. Still, by the Renaissance, medicine started to look slightly less medieval. Anatomy studies resumed, sometimes using freshly stolen corpses. Fun times. Physicians started differentiating between contagion and miasma, and very cautiously, people began touching water again. Not bathing exactly, just cautiously flirting with hygiene. A hand rinse here, a perfumed soak there. The 1400s were basically the talking stage between humans and water. 9. Reflection before the next bath. So, what have we learned tonight? That medieval people, bless them, were deeply creative in avoiding soap. They replaced water with vinegar, logic with leeches, and science with faith. But their strange medical habits also laid the groundwork for modern medicine. Unintentionally, of course. Every bad cure was a lesson learned. Every superstition eventually got tested, recorded, or debunked. And every failed leech session brought us one step closer to understanding infection, immunity, and the revolutionary idea that maybe, just maybe, clean water is good. Now, let's gently drift onward into the next part of our journey. The part where science finally washes up on shore, bringing with it plumbing, sewers, and the Industrial Revolution's obsession with cleanliness.
The Victorian soap boom, when bathing became a moral duty. At last, we've slogged through the mud of the Middle Ages and stepped, gingerly, into a new world. It's the 1800s. The Industrial Revolution is roaring. Steam engines are hissing. Cities are swelling. And for the first time in 1,000 years, humanity looks around and says, wait, maybe being clean feels kinda nice. Scene 1. How factories made soap sexy. Before the 19th century, soap was a luxury item. It was handmade, expensive, and often smelled like a goat that regretted its life choices. Only the rich could afford to lather up. But then came the factories, vast, grimy temples of progress, and with them, mass production. Suddenly, soap could be made in huge quantities using chemical processes that stripped the fat, purified the alkali, and added perfumes that didn't come from despair. Soap went from rare to regular, from aristocratic to accessible. And like all good products, it came with a marketing plan. Manufacturers didn't just sell cleanliness, they sold virtue. Because in Victorian England, being clean wasn't just about hygiene, it was about morality. Soap became a symbol of discipline, decency, and Christian duty. To be clean was to be civilized. To be dirty was to be damned. Scene 2. The Gospel according to Pears. If there's a single brand that turned soap into salvation, it was Pears Soap. Founded in London in 1807, it became one of the first companies to advertise aggressively and emotionally. They didn't just say, "Buy this soap." They said, "Buy this soap and prove you're a good person." Their ads showed pale, angelic children being washed pure. They promised mothers that cleanliness would make their children beautiful, healthy, and socially acceptable. One famous 1880s ad literally said, "Pears Soap, the first step toward lightening the white man's burden." Yes, you read that correctly. Victorian cleanliness came with a heavy dose of colonial arrogance. Soap wasn't just for your skin, it was for your soul, and apparently for the rest of the world's too. The idea was that by civilizing others, read washing them, Europeans were spreading progress. It's hard to imagine now, but those pastel advertisements of happy, shiny children were quietly carrying the weight of empire. So while factories were pumping out bars by the ton, the real product being sold was identity. Cleanliness was no longer a luxury, it was a moral expectation. Scene 4. Plumbing, the unsung hero of the 19th century. All that soap would have been useless without one thing: water. And for the first time in centuries, cities started figuring out how to deliver it safely. The rise of modern plumbing was nothing short of revolutionary. Pipes, faucets, sewers, toilets that actually flushed. It sounds boring until you realize it saved millions of lives. During the early 1800s, outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, and dysentery ravaged Europe's booming cities. Doctors didn't fully understand germs yet, but engineers understood filth. They could see that contaminated water was killing people faster than bad poetry. Enter men like Joseph Bazalgette, the British civil engineer who designed London's sewer system after the Great Stink of 1858, when the River Thames smelled so foul that Parliament literally fled the building. Bazalgette built over 1,000 miles of brick tunnels, carrying waste away from the city and replacing medieval cesspits with something approaching civilization. Suddenly, homes had running water, flushing toilets, and places to bathe without fear of catching a plague. Water became not the enemy, but the hero. Scene 5. Bathing, the new prayer. With clean water finally flowing, another revolution began, one that took place in the most intimate room of the house, the bathtub. Victorians didn't invent the bath, but they turned it into an event. Early tubs were giant copper or zinc basins hauled into the kitchen and filled with buckets of hot water. Only the head of the household got the first dip. Everyone else followed in the same water in descending order of social and familial importance. But as indoor plumbing spread, so did private bathrooms. By the late 1800s, wealthy homes had dedicated washrooms, and the middle class soon followed. Magazines and etiquette books urged daily bathing, not for health alone, but for respectability. A clean body reflected a clean mind, and a clean family reflected a clean conscience. The act of bathing became almost spiritual. People spoke of washing away the day's impurities, as though each scrub brought them closer to moral perfection. In short, bathing became the new prayer. Scene 5. Soap, Sex, and Social Climbing. Here's where things get even more fascinating and a little steamy. Victorian society had strict moral codes, but underneath those layers of lace and linen, advertising found a way to flirt. Soap ads began showing bare shoulders, smooth arms, luxurious hair cascading into baths. It was scandalous and irresistible. Women were told that using the right soap would make them radiant, desirable, even marriageable. Men were told that clean skin meant discipline, success, and self-control. Cleanliness wasn't just next to godliness, it was next to sex appeal. Brands like Lifebuoy and Sunlight soap sold fantasies of freshness and modernity. They linked soap with status. If you smelled clean, you must be important. In fact, Sunlight soap, produced by the Lever brothers, who later became Unilever, was marketed as the key to upward mobility. Its slogan might as well have been, "Scrub hard, rise higher." Soap became a ladder, and everyone was climbing.
Scene 6. Clean streets, clean souls. The obsession with personal hygiene soon spilled into public life. Victorian reformers saw cleanliness as the cure for poverty, crime, and sin. Public bathhouses were built across Europe and America. Cities installed fountains and washrooms. Children were inspected in schools for soap habits. If you were poor but clean, reformers praised your character. If you were poor and dirty, they saw moral failure. This moralization of hygiene had good and bad sides. On one hand, it encouraged better public health, fewer epidemics, cleaner neighborhoods, longer lives. On the other, it stigmatized those who couldn't afford soap or plumbing. Cleanliness became a form of social policing, a way to divide the worthy from the unworthy. Still, it's hard not to admire how swiftly a civilization that once feared water had turned it into a symbol of virtue. Within a single century, washing transformed from taboo to trend. Scene 7. Global soap and the empire of clean. By the late 19th century, soap was one of the world's biggest industries, and with empire came export. British, French, and American companies flooded colonies with bars and ads promising modernity. In India, Africa, and Southeast Asia, soap was marketed as the scent of civilization, an aromatic proof of Western superiority. It was soap wrapped in propaganda. Cleanliness became a colonial mission. Even children's primers taught that good nations were clean, backward ones dirty. One 1890s Sunlight ad depicted an African child being scrubbed white by a motherly British woman. An image so disturbing today it almost defies belief. But this was how the Victorian world saw itself, not just as clean, but as cleansing. Soap had become a moral empire all its own. Scene 8. When science finally caught up. And then, almost quietly, science caught up. In the mid-1800s, a Hungarian doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis noticed that doctors who washed their hands before childbirth dramatically reduced deaths from infection. His colleagues mocked him. They said hand washing was beneath them. They literally laughed him out of medicine. Decades later, Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch proved what Semmelweis already suspected.
Invisible microorganisms, germs, caused disease. Suddenly, the entire moral edifice of Victorian cleanliness got a scientific backbone. Soap wasn't just symbolic anymore, it was effective. What had started as moral propaganda became medical truth. Washing saved lives. Hospitals adopted antiseptic techniques. Public health campaigns began. And for the first time in history, humanity had both the technology and the understanding to stay clean and stay alive. Scene 9. Reflection. The Empire of Soap. Think about this transformation. 1,000 years earlier, Europeans feared water. They bathed rarely, if ever. They used perfume to mask decay and believed that holiness was dry. By 1900, the same continent was drenched in soap bubbles and self-righteousness. Cleanliness wasn't just a habit, it was a creed. And like all creeds, it had its zealots. The Victorians didn't just wash their bodies, they washed their language, their morals, their history. They believed that purity, physical and moral, could be manufactured, packaged, and sold. It's funny, isn't it? For all their pride and progress, they'd merely traded one superstition for another. Where medieval people feared dirt because it was sinful, Victorians feared it because it was socially embarrassing. Both were terrified of being seen as unclean, just for different reasons. Epilogue. The echo of the bath. Even now, centuries later, we still live in the shadow of that Victorian soap bubble. Every bottle of shampoo, every deodorant ad, every clean beauty product, they all trace their roots back to that moral revolution. We still associate cleanliness with goodness. We still fear the stigma of smell. And we still believe somewhere deep down that a spotless body means a spotless soul. Soap changed us, not just physically, but psychologically. It gave us control over our own scent, our own image, our own worth. And maybe that's why it stuck, because long after the bubbles fade, the belief remains that to be clean is to be worthy.
The 20th century hygiene craze, from germophobia to glamour. If the Victorians made soap moral, the 20th century made it marketable. This was the century when people stopped fearing filth as divine punishment and started fearing it as bad branding. Because nothing ruins your reputation faster than a little body odor, especially once someone invented mass advertising. And as we float into this bubbly new world, we find ourselves surrounded by shiny chrome faucets, cheerful jingle music, and an overwhelming sense that dirt has officially lost the war. Or has it? Scene 1. Welcome to the age of the bathroom. Picture it, 1920s America. Jazz is playing, cars are buzzing, and behind the scenes, something even more revolutionary is happening. The bathroom has become a room. Not an afterthought, not a cold tin tub dragged out once a week, but a permanent fixture. Homes now came with built-in bathtubs, sinks, and mirrors, the holy trinity of self-improvement. White porcelain gleamed like a temple altar. Polished chrome sparkled with the promise of modern living. The bathroom was marketed as the cleanest, most private place in the house, the room where you could literally reinvent yourself every morning. For advertisers, this was gold, because once people started locking themselves inside tiled rooms with mirrors, they became extremely easy to sell to. Suddenly, cleanliness wasn't just about not being dirty. It was about optimizing your hair, your skin, your scent, your very existence. Scene 2. Soap gets a makeover. By the early 1900s, soap wasn't just soap anymore. It had gone Hollywood. Companies began crafting entire personalities for their products.
Ivory soap, for instance, boasted that it was 99 and 44/100% pure. Why not round it up to 100? Because that extra decimal made people trust them more. Genius. Lifebuoy, on the other hand, introduced the concept of body odor, or BO, in their marketing. Before that, nobody had really worried about it. Sure, people smelled, but that was just people. Then Lifebuoy swooped in and said, "You may not notice your own BO, but others do." Boom. A whole new insecurity was born. Now you weren't just washing to be healthy, you were washing to avoid social death. This was the golden age of fear-based advertising. Subtle, polite, and absolutely devastating. Are you the one nobody wants to dance with? Is there a reason he doesn't call anymore? Could it be your breath? And so, a civilization that had once resisted bathing began buying soap like their social lives depended on it, because now they did. Scene 3. The birth of beauty hygiene. By the mid-20th century, the line between clean and beautiful had completely vanished. Cosmetic companies, seeing how easily soap companies had colonized the bathroom, charged in with face creams, tonics, and miracle powders. Hollywood helped. The silver screen made flawless skin, pearly teeth, and soft, perfumed hair the standard of glamour. Cleanliness now had a look. Stars like Grace Kelly and Audrey Hepburn didn't just embody elegance, they looked permanently freshly washed. Every advertisement told women that they could be radiant too if they only used this one soap, this one shampoo, this one scent. And men? They were finally being dragged into the mirror too. Enter Old Spice, Colgate, Gillette, Brut, all promising rugged cleanliness that somehow smelled like pine forests and male confidence. Cleanliness had become sexy, profitable, and deeply gendered. For women, it meant being pure and desirable. For men, it meant being strong and self-assured. Either way, there was money to be made, and a lot of it. Scene 4. Germs, panic, and the rise of the lab coat. Then science showed up again, this time with a microscope and a marketing budget. Remember how the Victorians made soap moral? The 20th century made it scientific. Antiseptic became the word of the decade. Listerine wasn't just mouthwash, it was a medical breakthrough that could apparently cure loneliness. Advertisements declared, "Often a bridesmaid, never a bride," because she had halitosis. That was an actual campaign, a woman's entire romantic failure blamed on bad breath. And it worked so well that within a few years, Listerine's sales exploded. Soon everything was antibacterial, germ-fighting, or clinically tested. Soap companies hired fake doctors in lab coats to explain why their product killed 99% of germs. Which germs? Unclear, but the coat was white, so it must be true. People started seeing invisible enemies everywhere: doorknobs, hands, other people. And just like that, hygiene turned into a quiet kind of paranoia. The 20th century had birthed not just cleanliness, but germophobia. Scene 5. War and washing. World War I and World War II didn't just change geopolitics, they changed bathroom habits. Soldiers in the trenches discovered the necessity of hygiene under horrific conditions. Lice, trench foot, infections, these weren't abstract dangers, they were daily realities. Governments realized that cleanliness wasn't a luxury, it was a matter of survival. So when the wars ended, returning soldiers brought home a powerful message: stay clean, stay alive. The military even helped standardize products like toothpaste, razors, and soap bars, all designed for quick and efficient hygiene. Post-war companies rode that momentum straight into the suburbs. Now, cleanliness was patriotic. The clean home was the American dream. The clean child was the future. Every ad seemed to hum the same tune: cleanliness is happiness, health, and home. The bathroom, had become the center of the modern moral universe, tiled, sanitized, and proudly fluorescent.
Scene 6. The Age of Artificial Freshness. By the 1960s and 70s, people were scrubbing themselves more than ever, but the idea of freshness was evolving. Now it wasn't just about being clean, it was about smelling clean. Deodorants, sprays, powders, and air fresheners invaded the market. Everything came with mountain breeze or spring rain or ocean mist. People wanted to smell like environments they'd never actually been to. You didn't have to be clean anymore. You just had to smell like you were. And of course, capitalism had found its sweet spot: perpetual insecurity. If one soap made you smell good, maybe another made you smell better. If your hair was clean, was it clean enough? If your face was clear, was it glowing? The modern hygiene industry turned self-maintenance into an endless quest for improvement. Because there's one thing you can always sell: doubt. On the 7th scene begins the Cleanliness Becomes Culture. By the end of the 20th century, cleanliness wasn't just a routine, it was identity. Whole subcultures formed around it: minimalist design, white-tiled bathrooms, pastel aesthetics, wellness spas, clean eating, clean beauty. The word clean had gone far beyond soap. It now meant purity of lifestyle, and it never stopped growing. New products arrived faster than you could use them. Antibacterial gels, whitening toothpaste, charcoal scrubs, scented wipes. People were washing, scrubbing, and sanitizing themselves into oblivion. Somewhere, medieval peasants were probably rolling in their unwashed graves whispering, "You're overdoing it, mate." Scene 8. The irony of modern cleanliness. And here's the twist. After centuries of dirt, disease, and despair, humans finally won the war against filth. But in doing so, they created new problems. All that scrubbing stripped away the natural oils our ancestors never worried about. All those antibacterial soaps bred stronger bacteria. And all those perfumes and chemicals introduced allergies and microplastics. We became too clean for our own good. Our immune systems, once trained by mud and microbes, started getting lazy. Autoimmune diseases and skin sensitivities began to rise. In the quest for perfection, we scrubbed away the balance. Number 9. The modern ritual. And yet, every night, as you step into a steaming shower or draw a warm bath, you're continuing a ritual that's thousands of years old. You might light a candle, pour some bath salts, and tell yourself it's for relaxation. But deep down, you're reenacting the same ancient human urge: to wash away the day, to feel pure again, to start fresh. It's not just about cleanliness, it's about rebirth. The Romans did it in marble halls. The Victorians did it with guilt. We do it with scented foam and Spotify playlists. Same ritual, different soap. Epilogue. Clean at last. So tonight, as you lie there, maybe freshly bathed, maybe not, remember how far we've come. From medieval peasants terrified of water, to Victorians scrubbing for salvation, to modern humans exfoliating their elbows twice a week. We've turned washing into an art form, a science, a religion, and an industry. And yet, for all the bubbles and branding, the meaning remains simple: to feel human. Because under all the lather, all the marketing, all the sterile white tiles, we're still just creatures trying to wash off the day and drift peacefully into the night.
Of perfume, piety, and pure denial. So, by now, you're probably wondering, if medieval people weren't exactly bathing, what did they do to keep from smelling like a compost pile wrapped in wool? The short answer: perfume. The long answer: too much perfume. Perfume wasn't just a luxury item. It was a form of denial wrapped in rose water. People genuinely believed that scent itself could ward off illness. The logic went something like this. If disease comes from bad air, then good air will protect you. So naturally, everyone started drowning themselves in herbs, spices, and floral oils like they were auditioning for a medieval version of a Chanel ad. The wealthy had little sachets of lavender, rosemary, and mint sewn into their sleeves or tucked into their corsets. Some even hung dried oranges stuffed with cloves around their necks. Imagine a citrusy necklace that doubles as a medieval deodorant. Peasants didn't have such luxuries. They just hoped the smell of manure and wood smoke blended into something less offensive over time. Spoiler, it didn't. And while we're on the subject of denial, let's talk about how bathing itself became a sort of moral issue. The church, never one to miss out on controlling bodily behavior, had mixed feelings about hygiene. Too much washing could be seen as vanity. And vanity, of course, was a sin. Because why should anyone feel too good about themselves in the 1300s? Monks and nuns often bragged, yes, bragged, about how infrequently they washed. There are actual recorded letters of holy men claiming they hadn't bathed in decades as proof of their devotion. Apparently, spiritual cleanliness and literal cleanliness were mutually exclusive. But then again, things got confusing. Some monasteries had elaborate bathhouses. Others banned bathing entirely. So it really depended on whether your abbot was team scrub occasionally or team die holy and smelly. And while the church frowned upon naked communal bathing, people didn't exactly stop doing it. Bathhouses still existed in major cities, operating somewhere between a spa and a social club. Think steam, chatter, and the occasional moral scandal. Because, of course, there was always a scandal. In medieval Paris, for example, bathhouses were so notorious for extra services that city officials eventually banned mixed bathing. Naturally, no one listened. Apparently, if you throw enough steam and warm water together, morality becomes very negotiable. Let's drift over to another strange detail. Medieval doctors, the real charmers they were, warned people that hot baths opened the pores and allowed sickness to enter the body. So yes, bathing was both sinful and dangerous. You could offend God and catch the plague. Double whammy. So people started leaning into what I like to call the philosophy of dust. If you didn't disturb the dirt, it couldn't hurt you. That was the idea. And honestly, it's kind of poetic. Filthy, but poetic.
The great rebranding of cleanliness. Now, let's fast forward a little, because as centuries passed, Europe started to realize maybe, just maybe, smelling like damp sheep wasn't a virtue. But of course, the change didn't happen overnight. It took wars, science, and a lot of powdered wigs to bring bathing back into fashion. By the Renaissance, things were getting complicated. People wanted to look elegant and cultured, but still not too clean. Soap existed, sure, but it was made from animal fat and ashes, and it smelled like someone set fire to a barn. So instead, people washed their faces and hands and called it a day. A light refresh, as they'd say, while wearing 10 layers of perfume-soaked velvet. The 16th century saw nobles bathing maybe once a month, and that was considered ambitious. Queen Elizabeth I famously claimed she bathed once a month whether she needed it or not, which raises questions about what she considered needing it. But here's where the shift began. Doctors started realizing that cleanliness actually helped prevent disease. After several plagues, they noticed that maybe, just maybe, stagnant water and filth weren't great for public health. And by the time the Enlightenment rolled in, Europe began rebranding cleanliness as civilized.
Bathhouses returned, plumbing slowly improved, and personal hygiene became a symbol of progress, not sin. The Victorians in particular took it to extremes. They practically weaponized soap. Cleanliness became tied to morality, respectability, and even imperialism. Because, of course, it did. Nothing says we're better than everyone else like a country obsessed with scrubbing. Ironically, the same culture that once saw bathing as suspicious now saw dirt as a moral failing. So we'd gone full circle, from too dirty to too clean, with a brief detour through lavender-scented hypocrisy. And yet, some traditions stuck around. We still perfume ourselves. We still sanitize everything. And maybe, just maybe, we still judge each other a little based on smell. So next time you step into a shower, imagine explaining it to a 13th century monk. He'd probably faint from horror or envy. And somewhere in the echo of time, a medieval bath attendant just quietly whispers, "Told you so."
And so they slept in their dirt, happily ever after. Hey there. If you're still awake, congratulations. You've officially survived 2 hours of medieval hygiene, spiritual dirt, and royal body odor. Honestly, that's more than most nobles could have managed in the 14th century. Let's take a quiet breath here. Imagine the faint smell of wood smoke, old stone walls, and damp wool drifting through a candlelit hall. Somewhere, a monk is chanting. Someone else is complaining about fleas. And outside, a muddy village is settling into the night. It's oddly peaceful, isn't it? For all their lack of soap and scientific understanding, medieval people lived in a kind of stillness we rarely feel today. No buzzing lights, no phones, no running water. Just slow days, cold air, and a very loose relationship with hygiene. And maybe that's the strangest part. They weren't necessarily miserable about it. For them, dirt wasn't disgusting. It was normal. It was life. You were born into mud, worked in it, prayed over it, and were buried under it. In a way, being clean all the time might have seemed unnatural. Let's drift back to a small medieval town for a moment. The baker's up early, kneading dough with hands that haven't seen soap in days. The blacksmith's hammering away, sweat and soot mixing into his skin like permanent armor. Children are chasing chickens through the mud, their laughter echoing against thatched walls. And above it all, the faint sound of church bells, calling everyone to prayer. It's not glamorous. It's not perfumed. But it's alive. And yes, it smelled terrible, but it also meant something. Every scent, smoke, sweat, animals, rain, told a story about who you were, what you did, and where you belonged. They didn't scrub it off because it was part of their identity. It was the smell of survival, of belonging to the earth itself. Now we shower daily, douse ourselves in citrus and sandalwood, and call it self-care. We've built entire industries around the idea of not smelling human. And yet, there's something oddly comforting about imagining a time when no one expected perfection. When life was rough, filthy, and simple, and nobody pretended otherwise. Let's float on that thought for a moment. Because somewhere deep down, there's something universal about dirt and water. They've always been the start and end of every story. We rise from one and return to the other. You can almost picture it. A weary medieval farmer stepping into a wooden tub once a year. The water is lukewarm. The candles flicker.
He sighs, half relief, half guilt, because he's not sure if this is luxury or sin. And as he sinks in, he probably wonders why people make such a fuss about being clean. After all, tomorrow, he'll be covered in mud again. History is full of these little contradictions. Moments that feel absurd to us now, but made perfect sense then. People feared what we take for granted. They resisted what we now celebrate. And maybe centuries from now, someone will look back at us, at our bottled water, our hand sanitizer obsessions, our 10-step skincare routines, and say they were clean, but a little crazy. It's kind of poetic, don't you think? Because for all our progress, for all our plumbing and disinfectant, we're still chasing the same thing medieval people were: comfort. They found it in faith, in routine, in shared smells and shared dirt. We find it in warm showers and scented candles. Different centuries, same search for peace. So maybe the moral of the story is this: bathing habits may change, but humans don't. We're still beautifully irrational, too proud, too superstitious, too hopeful. We still build strange rituals around ordinary things. And we still want to feel clean, not just in body, but in spirit. Let's be honest, history is less about dates and kings, and more about moments like these. Someone heating water over a fire. Someone scrubbing a child's hands before supper. Someone deciding for the first time that maybe, just maybe, being clean feels kinda nice. And that's the quiet miracle of it all. Not the wars, not the politics, just the small human act of trying to feel better, even if it's once a year. So as we close tonight's story, let's take one more deep breath. Let the centuries fall away. You're clean, you're safe, you're warm, which statistically makes you one of the luckiest people in history. And if you doze off now, that's okay. You've earned it. The Middle Ages are over. The bathwater is warm, and tomorrow, thankfully, you can shower as many times as you want. Good night, traveler. Sleep well, and may your pores stay blissfully plague-free.